In the 1990 seconds, within a few years of each other, an elderly couple died in Brooklyn, New York. Their names were Donald and Mildred Othmer. He had been a professor of chemical engineering. She had been a schoolteacher and the daughter of small-town shopkeepers. They had lived for decades in the same comfortable but unremarkable Brooklyn home. And when their estate was finally settled, the people who handled it sat looking at a number that did not seem possible. The combined fortune of this quiet professor and his schoolteacher wife came to nearly $750 million, $750 million, a sum on the scale of the great industrial dynasties of America, held at the end by two retired educators. In a brownstone in Brooklyn, Donald and Mildred Othmer had not built a company. They had not invented a product that made them rich. Donald held valuable chemical patents and earned a good professional living, but a professor's living, not a tycoon's. Mildred taught school. They earned solid, respectable, entirely ordinary professional incomes. Nothing about their salaries explains a $750 million estate. What explains it is a single decision the Othmers made in the early 1960 seconds. A decision rooted in a friendship, in a hometown, and in a quiet faith in a young man almost no one outside Nebraska had yet heard of. They handed that young man their savings, and then they did the hardest thing in all of investing, for more than 30 years. They left it completely alone. This is the story of how they did it, and what it can teach the rest of us. To understand the Othmers' fortune, you have to begin not in Brooklyn, but in Omaha, Nebraska. Because the entire story turns on a hometown. Donald Othmer was born in Omaha in 1904. He grew up there in that close-knit Midwestern city before going on to a distinguished career as a chemical engineer. He became a professor at the Polytechnic Institute in Brooklyn. He was, by every account, a gifted and serious man of science, the holder of numerous patents, a respected academic and authority in his field. His chemical patents earned him real money over his career. He was professionally successful, comfortably well off, but he was a professor, living a professor's life. His wife, Mildred, was also from that same Nebraska world. Mildred Othmer was the daughter of a family that ran a small business in Omaha. Shopkeepers, people of modest, practical, Midwestern means. Mildred trained as a teacher and worked as a schoolteacher. She came from exactly the kind of careful, frugal, sensible background that this channel has found again and again at the root of quiet fortunes. She understood the value of a dollar. She understood patience. She had been raised by people who knew that wealth, if it came at all, came slowly. Donald and Mildred married, and they built their life together in Brooklyn. They lived in a comfortable home. They were cultured, intelligent, and engaged with the world. Donald with his science, Mildred with her teaching and her interests. But they did not live extravagantly. They were not flashy people. They lived, by every account, well within the solid professional income their careers provided, which meant that, year after year, there was money left over. Money that did not need to be spent. Money that could be put somewhere to grow. They were, in short, an ordinary, successful American couple of their era. A professor and a teacher. Intelligent, comfortable, careful with money, rooted in a Nebraska hometown. Nothing about them, to any outside eye, suggested a fortune of $750 million. But the Othmers had one connection. One hometown thread that almost no one else in America had. They knew the Buffett family of Omaha. In the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, a young man in Omaha was quietly beginning a career in investing. His name was Warren Buffett. Today, that name is known across the entire world. But in 1960, Warren Buffett was not famous. He was a young investor in his late 20s and early 30s, running an investment partnership out of his Nebraska hometown, managing money for a small group of people, most of whom knew him or knew his family. Personally, the Othmers knew the Buffett family. The connection ran through Omaha, through the hometown, through the web of relationships that a close Midwestern city creates. And the Othmers, watching this serious, brilliant young hometown investor, made a decision. They decided to trust him with their money. In the early 1960 seconds, Donald and Mildred Othmer each invested with Warren Buffett's partnership. The figure most associated with their story is that they each put in roughly $25,000. Pause on the size of that. $25,000 each. In the money of the early 1960 seconds, that was a meaningful sum, real savings, accumulated by careful professional people. But it was not a tycoon's stake. It was the considered, sensible investment of a professor and a teacher, putting their faith and a portion of their savings into a young man from their hometown, whom they had reason to believe was unusually capable. Fine. Now, we will be honest, as this channel always is, about an element of fortune in this story. The Othmers had access to something almost no one else had. They had a personal connection to a young investor who would turn out to be arguably the greatest of his century. Most people in the early 1960 seconds could not have invested with Warren Buffett. They did not know him. They had no way in. So we are not telling you that the Othmers' specific path, find a young genius from your hometown, is a path you can simply copy. It is not. But hold on, because the real lesson of the Othmers is not who they invested with. It is what they did afterward. And what they did afterward is something anyone can copy exactly. In time, Warren Buffett wound down his original partnership. The investors in that partnership were given a choice. They could take their money, by then already substantially grown, and walk away. Or they could move their stake into the shares of a company that Buffett was now using as his investment vehicle, a struggling former textile manufacturer in New England, called Berkshire Hathaway. The Othmers chose Berkshire Hathaway. They took their grown stake, and they held it, as shares in Buffett's company. And that choice, to convert into Berkshire shares, and then to hold them, is the hinge of the entire $750 million outcome. Because the Othmers, having made that choice, then did almost nothing at all for the next 30 years. The first principle of the Othmers' fortune is the one that sounds, at first, like no principle at all. They did nothing, and doing nothing for 30 years is one of the hardest and most valuable disciplines in all of investing. Think about what the Othmers had to live through holding their Berkshire shares. Without selling for 3 decades. They held through the brutal bear market of 1973 and 1974. When American stocks lost nearly half their value. They held through the stagflation of the late 1970 seconds, when commentators declared the stock market effectively finished. They held through the crash of October 1987, when the market fell more than 20% in a single day. They held through every recession, every scare, every frightening headline of 30 long years. And it was not only market fear they had to withstand. Berkshire Hathaway's own share price could be volatile. It rose over the decades to prices that must have seemed dizzying, and at every new height, there was a fresh temptation to sell, to take the profit, to lock in the gain. The Othmers never did. Why is doing nothing so hard? Because every force in the financial world is designed to make you do something. The news urges action. The falling market screams at you to sell in fear. The rising market whispers at you to sell in pride. Friends, brokers, headlines, your own restless mind, all of them constantly push you to act. And almost every action for a long-term investor is a mistake. Every sale interrupts the compounding. Every clever adjustment introduces a chance to be wrong. The Othmers' genius, and it was a genius, even if a quiet one, was the discipline to resist all of it, to sit, to hold, to let 30 years pass, without interrupting the machine. Hi. And here is the arithmetic that the doing nothing made possible. Berkshire Hathaway under Warren Buffett compounded at an extraordinary rate over those decades, far above the long-term average of the stock market itself. When money compounds at a high rate, the doublings come faster. And over 30 years, a high-rate compounding produces results that genuinely strain belief. $25,000 compounding at the rate Berkshire achieved doubles and doubles and doubles again, and each doubling is larger than the last. The early doublings turned 25,000 into 50, then 100,000. The later doublings, decades on, each added tens and then hundreds of millions of dollars. Far thunder. This is the cruel and beautiful shape of compounding, and the Othmer story shows it at its most extreme. For the first 10 or 15 years, their investment grew, but in sums that, while real, did not look like a dynasty. A patient observer in 1975 would have seen a nice, healthy holding, not $750 million. The truly staggering wealth arrived in the final stretch. It arrived because they were still holding. The investors who took their money out in the early years, and many of Buffett's early partners did exactly that, captured a good return, and then missed the mountain. The Othmers stayed for the mountain. We should be clear and honest about the unusual ingredient here. The Othmers' compounding rate was exceptional because Warren Buffett is an exceptional investor, and most people will not and should not expect to match that specific rate. But do not let the rarity of the rate hide the universality of the lesson. The Othmers' real achievement was not finding Buffett. It was the 30 years of iron patience after they found him. And that patience, the discipline to choose a sound investment and then hold it untouched through every storm for decades, is available to absolutely everyone. The Othmers did not get rich because they were clever every year. They got rich because they were patient for 30. The first principle was patience. The second principle is the one that made the patience survivable. For 30 years, the Othmers lived a comfortable, stable, professional life that never at any point required them to reach into the Berkshire stake. Donald and Mildred Othmer had genuine professional incomes. Donald's salary as a distinguished professor and the earnings from his valuable chemical patents gave them a solid and reliable cash flow. Mildred had her career as well. They did not need the investment to live. Their ordinary, respectable professional earnings comfortably covered their ordinary, respectable life. And that fact, simple as it sounds, is the entire reason the Berkshire shares could be left alone for 30 years. Consider the contrast with how most people treat an investment. For most people, savings are a resource to be drawn upon. The car breaks down. You take from savings. The roof needs repair. You take from savings. A nicer home becomes possible, a more comfortable life beckons, and the investment account is where the money comes from. Most people's investments are not really long-term holdings at all. They are reservoirs with the tap left running. The Othmers kept the tap entirely shut because their professional incomes covered their lives. The Berkshire stake was never a reservoir to draw from. It was a sealed vault. Nothing went in after the original investment. And, crucially, nothing ever came out. And the Othmers' personal frugality made this even more secure. They were not extravagant people. They lived comfortably with culture and books and intellectual richness, but without flash, without waste, without the constant upgrading that drains so many prosperous lives. They lived in the same Brooklyn home for decades. Their tastes were the tastes of educated, sensible people, not of show-offs. And so the gap between their solid professional income and their moderate spending stayed open and wide, which meant that not only did they never need to sell the Berkshire shares, they had no pressure on those shares at all. The investment was free. Free to compound for 30 uninterrupted years. This is the partnership at the heart of every story in this channel, and the Othmers show it with unusual clarity. Patience and a sustainable life are two halves of one machine. You cannot hold a great investment for 30 years through willpower alone. You can only hold it for 30 years if your life, the entire time, is funded by something other than that investment. The Othmers had that. Their careers paid for their lives, and so their investment was never asked to do anything. Except the one thing investments do best when left alone: grow. We will be honest here, as we always are. The Othmers had no children, and a professional couple's costs are genuinely lighter without them. Their path had real advantages, and we will not pretend otherwise. But the principle beneath their success holds for everyone, without exception. Fund your life from your income. Keep your spending below what you earn. And then let your investments be investments, sealed, untouched, free to compound, rather than reservoirs slowly drained by the ordinary leaks of an ordinary life. The third principle of the Othmer's story is the one that gave the fortune its ultimate meaning. And it is the principle this channel returns to in every single episode. They knew what the money was for. Donald and Mildred Othmer were, to their core, educators. He was a professor. She was a teacher. Education was not merely their profession. It was their deepest value, the thing they believed in, the thing they had given their working lives to. And as their quiet fortune grew across the decades, the Othmers thought carefully about what it should ultimately do. They did not intend to spend it on themselves. A larger fortune was never going to mean a grander life for Donald and Mildred Othmer. They had decided, instead, that their wealth would go to education, to science, to medicine, and to the institution. That carried those things forward. Understand what this clarity of purpose did for them. When you know exactly what your wealth is for, the decades of discipline stop being a sacrifice. The Othmers were not denying themselves a grander life and resenting it. They had no wish for a grander life. They had a purpose, the support of education and science, and every year they held their Berkshire shares. That purpose grew larger and more powerful. Their patience was not grim endurance. It was the steady, satisfying growth of a gift they were preparing for the world they believed in. Facile, fadi. And the Othmers did the essential, practical thing, the thing some others in this channel's stories failed to do. They planned. They had wills. They had clear intentions set down properly, so that when they were gone, the enormous fortune would flow, exactly where they wanted it to flow. They worked, as careful and intelligent people do, with the structure and the professionals needed to make certain their wishes would hold. The Othmers did not leave their $750 million to chance, or to confusion, or to a courtroom. They left it to a purpose, named, chosen, and made certain. Long before the end, there is a lesson in this that applies no matter the size of your fortune. A purpose is what holds a long financial plan together. Without one, even a strong saver eventually drifts. The discipline slackens, the spending creeps upward, the plan slowly dissolves. With one with a real, felt, specific purpose. The discipline has a center of gravity. The Othmers' center of gravity was education. It held them steady for 30 years, and it ensured that at the end, the staggering result of their patience would not be wasted, but aimed precisely at the thing they love. If you wanted to summarize what made it possible for two retired educators to build $750 million, you could do worse than this list. One sound investment made with hometown trust, a comfortable life funded entirely by their careers. 30 years of doing absolutely nothing. A purpose, education that they loved and never lost sight of. And the careful, responsible planning to make certain the gift would land exactly where they aimed it. For the entire 30-year span in which their $25,000 stakes were quietly becoming a dynasty. Donald and Mildred Othmer told the world essentially nothing. They did not behave like people sitting on a hidden fortune. They did not boast. They did not upgrade their lives to match their secret balance sheet. Donald continued his work as a professor and a man of science, Mildred lived her cultured, engaged life. They remained to their colleagues, their neighbours, and even many of those close to them. Simply a distinguished professor and his intelligent wife. Comfortable, accomplished, and entirely unremarkable in their wealth. The hundreds of millions of dollars were invisible, because the Othmers never once put them on display. There is a lesson in that long silence, the same one this channel keeps uncovering. The Othmers' compounding succeeded in part because their wealth was quiet. No one pressured them to spend it because no one knew it existed. No one envied it, no one schemed for it, no one talked them into a clever move or a panicked sale. The shares sat undisturbed, in a sealed vault in a quiet life, because the Othmers kept the entire thing out of sight for 30 quiet years. And in keeping with everything this channel teaches, the Othmers did not act alone. In one obvious sense, they had the ultimate trusted partner. They had placed their capital with a financial steward of historic skill, and then let him do the work of growing it. But beyond that, they did the responsible things that careful people do. They had legal and financial professionals. They had proper wills and clear plans. They built the structure that would carry their intentions out. We say this in every episode. The decision was theirs. The patience, above all, was theirs. But they surrounded that decision with trusted, competent people who helped make certain it would hold. Donald Othmer died in 1995. Mildred Othmer died in 1998, a few years after her husband. They had shared a long life, a marriage, 2 careers, a comfortable Brooklyn home, and a 30-year secret that even they may rarely have spoken of aloud. When Mildred's estate was finally settled, the full number became known. The combined Othmer fortune approached $750 million. And the people who learned it, the institutions, the executors, the public, reacted exactly as the world always reacts in these stories. With astonishment. A professor and a schoolteacher. $750 million. There had been no business empire. No invention that minted a fortune. No inheritance from a wealthy dynasty. There had only been 2 careful educators. 1 good decision. 30 years of perfect patience. And the simple, world-changing power of compound growth, left entirely undisturbed. When the Othmer fortune was settled, it did exactly what Donald and Mildred Othmer had planned across all those quiet decades for it to do. It went to education, to science, and to medicine. The bulk of the enormous estate was directed to institutions of learning and healing. Donald Othmer's own university, the Brooklyn institution where he had taught chemical engineering for decades, received an extraordinary gift, a transformative sum. Hospitals received major support. Educational and scientific institutions received the kind of funding. That changes what a place is capable of. New buildings, endowed programs, scholarships, research that would carry forward for generations. The fortune that 2 educators had grown in silence flowed back in full into education itself. Think about the symmetry of it, the same quiet symmetry this channel finds again and again. Donald and Mildred Othmer had spent their working lives in education. They had earned their living teaching and discovering and passing knowledge forward. And then they took the fortune that their patience had grown, and they gave it back to the very world that had given them their purpose. The professor's wealth endowed the university. The teacher's wealth opened doors for students. Their $750 million did not buy them a single grander year of life. It bought, instead, decades and decades of education for strangers. They would never meet and consider what their patience truly created. When you give $25,000 to education, you fund something real but bounded. A scholarship, a piece of equipment. When you give $750 million to education, you change institutions permanently. You build the buildings that will hold a century of students. You endow the programs that will outlast everyone now living. The Othmers' 30 years of doing nothing did not merely multiply their money. It multiplied their values. It took their belief in education and gave that belief the power to act on the world for generations after they were gone. They had no children to inherit their wealth. They had no family business to pass down, but they had a purpose, education, the work of their whole lives, and they gave 30 years of patient compounding entirely to that purpose. They wanted the institutions of learning and healing that they had believed in and served to be permanently stronger, and with $25,000 each and 30 years of patience. They made it so, on a scale that the world could scarcely believe. Now, what does the Othmer's story actually teach us? Lesson 1. Master the discipline of doing nothing. The Othmer's fortune was built not by clever activity, but by 30 years of deliberate, disciplined inaction. Almost every action a long-term investor takes, every sale, every clever adjustment, every panicked or prideful move interrupts the compounding. The Othmers resisted all of it. Once you have chosen a sound, broad investment, the most powerful thing you can do is, very often, nothing at all. Choose well once. Then have the discipline to leave it alone. Lesson 2. Fund your life from your income, not your investments. The Othmers could leave their stake untouched for 30 years, because their careers paid for their lives. Their investment was a sealed vault, not a reservoir with the tap running. Keep your spending below your income. Cover your life from what you earn. And let your investments be genuinely long-term, sealed, undisturbed, free to compound, rather than a fund you quietly drain for every expense that arises. Lesson 3. The rate matters, but patience matters more. The Othmers had a rare and exceptional compounding rate, because they had a rare and exceptional investor. Most people will not match that rate and should not expect to. But here is the truth that matters. Even at the ordinary long-term rate of a simple, broad index fund, 30 years of untouched compounding produces a result that would astonish you. You may not be able to find the next Warren Buffett, but you can absolutely copy the Othmers' patience. And patience applied to a sensible, ordinary investment is itself a kind of fortune. Lesson 4. Quiet beats loud. The Othmers told almost no one. They did not display their wealth, did not upgrade their lives to match it, did not seek admiration. Their fortune stayed invisible, and that invisibility protected it. No one pressured it, envied it, or talked them into a mistake. The discipline to compound for 30 years is, in large part, the discipline of not needing anyone to know. Build in the quiet. Let the loud world look right past you. Lesson 5. Have a circle. The Othmers placed their capital with a trusted steward, and they surrounded their plan with competent legal and financial professionals. They had proper wills and clear, well-built intentions. Their fortune did not end in confusion or a courtroom. It flowed exactly where they had aimed it. You make your own decisions, but you must have trusted, capable people to help you execute them, hold your paperwork, and carry out your plan. The decision is yours. The execution should never be solitary. Lesson 6. Know what it is for. The Othmers knew, across all 30 years, exactly what their fortune was for. The support of education, science, and medicine. That purpose is what made their patience effortless rather than painful. They were not denying themselves a grander life. They were growing a gift. If you do not know what your wealth is ultimately for, you will spend more of it than you should, and the discipline will erode. If you do know, if the purpose is real and you can feel it, then the decades of patience acquire a center of gravity that holds for a lifetime. And there is one final reflection in the Othmer's story. Gentler than a rule. Donald and Mildred Othmer shared their long life together. 2 careers, 1 home, 1 quiet and astonishing secret. They built something vast, and they built it as partners. There is a quiet beauty in that. Their patience was not a lonely vigil, as it was for some others in this channel's stories. It was a shared project, held between 2 people who trusted each other, and trusted their purpose. So take the Othmers' discipline, and their patience, and their clarity. But take as well this gentler thing. A slow fortune is easier to build and far warmer to live alongside when it is shared with the people you love. 5. Before we close, a practical bridge from the Othmer's story to your situation. Because a case study is only useful if it changes something this week. 1. Choose one sound, broad investment and commit in advance to a 30-year hold. The Othmers' result came from one good decision followed by 30 years of leaving it alone. You cannot find their specific investor, but you can choose a broad, low-cost total market index fund, a sound, durable holding of hundreds or thousands of companies, and decide, consciously and now, that this money is committed for decades. Not for trading. 2. Build a wall between your life and your long-term investments. The Othmers funded their life from their careers and never touched the Berkshire stake. Keep your long-term investments in a separate account, one with no debit card, no easy withdrawal, and cover your living costs and a separate emergency reserve from your income. The investment account is a sealed vault. Money goes in for decades. Nothing comes out. 3. Make the patience automatic, so willpower is never tested. The Othmer's 30-year hold was a feat of discipline, but you can build that discipline into the machine. Set up automatic monthly contributions into your index fund. Switch on automatic dividend reinvestment, and then deliberately make it hard to interfere. Check the account, rarely delete the trading app. Engineer your finances so that doing nothing is the easiest possible thing to do. 4. Decide now how you will behave in the crashes you know are coming. The Othmers held through 1973, through 1987, through every storm of 30 years. In your own 30 years, several crashes will come. Decide today, in calm times, that your plan is not to sell, that a falling market is simply a sale, and your contributions continue straight through it. A decision made in calm is the one that will hold when the fear arrives. 5. Write down your purpose. Name your circle and make your plan certain. The Othmers knew their purpose was education, and they had proper wills and trusted professionals to carry it out. This week, write down in plain words what your wealth is ultimately for. Identify the honest, competent people who will help you, and make sure your intentions are set down properly, validly, and findably. The Othmers' fortune reached its purpose because they did this. Do not leave the destination of your life's work to chance. If you do those 5 things, even imperfectly, even slowly, you are running on your own scale. The same program Donald and Mildred Othmer ran for 30 years. You will almost certainly not arrive at $750 million. Their compounding rate was a rare and historic thing, but you will end up far further along than the great majority of people who out-earned you and outspent you every single year. And you will have proven in your own life the truth their story shouts. That is the quiet promise of compound interest, demonstrated on the most staggering scale by a professor and a schoolteacher who made one good decision. And then, for 30 years, simply let it grow. Donald and Mildred Othmer spent their lives as educators. A professor of chemical engineering and a schoolteacher, living in the same comfortable Brooklyn home for decades. To their colleagues, their neighbours, even many close to them, they were a distinguished but ordinary professional couple. That was the visible life. It hid one of the most staggering fortunes in modern American history. Behind that quiet life, 2 careful educators from a Nebraska hometown had each handed roughly $25,000 to a young, then unknown investor named Warren Buffett, and then done the single hardest thing in all of investing. For 30 years, through every crash and every temptation, they left it completely alone. It grew to nearly $750 million. And when their estate was settled, it flowed exactly as they had planned, into the universities, the laboratories, and the hospitals of the world they had spent their lives serving. We talk a great deal in modern personal finance about getting rich quickly. About leverage, side income, the perfect entry, the well-timed exit. All of those things have their place. But the quiet truth, the one the financial press rarely tells because it is slow and it does not sell, is that the most reliable path to deep, durable, world-changing wealth is the one the Othmers walk. Patient, boring, consistent, unglamorous. Decade after decade after decade. Effective. If there is a North Star in this channel, a single thesis we will return to in every story, in every case studied. It is this. Ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary patience build slow fortunes. More of them are out there right now in comfortable homes and quiet careers than the world will ever notice. And the country, its libraries, its hospitals, its universities, its forests, is shaped quietly by their hands. If you want more stories like this one, stories of ordinary, underestimated people who built extraordinary things, subscribe. There is no shortage of them. We are only getting started.